Welcome to the South Carolina Trade Talk podcast. I'm Dr. David DePlass at the Tommy and Victoria Baker School of Business at the Citadel and a member of the South Carolina International Trade Coalition. Today, we are going to talk about intelligence and the lessons to be learned in business. I would like to go ahead and welcome Dr. Larry Valero, Associate Professor of Intelligence and Security at the Citadel. And welcome, Larry.
Thank you, David, for having me. Good morning.
Good morning. I appreciate it. Thanks for being on our podcast, Larry. So go ahead and if you could, please educate people here. Tell us a little bit about what is intelligence, how you define it, what is it?
Well, that's actually an interesting question. Defining intelligence really depends on who you ask. There's no definitive definition, whether you're an intelligence professional or a scholar who studies intelligence. Everyone seems to have their own definition and approach, as does the US government. But let me just put it in basic terms for you, David. Intelligence is specialized information that is used to aid in decision-making. That's what it is at a very fundamental basis. That aid can support national security, it can support law enforcement, or it can support business enterprises as well.
So we talk a little bit about the definition. So obviously, as you just described, it is becoming, I think, a major topic. A lot of companies do want to ask themselves, so beyond that application of obviously the military, thank goodness, intelligence is available out there. So when we talk a little bit about intelligence and being in the forefront of the minds of very strategic decision-making, what would you say are the best practices? So if you're talking a little bit about that application of seeing beyond the definition, what would be kind of like steps or best practices or approach, things that people should be thinking, considering doing on a day-to-day basis to make these very strategic decisions?
Yes, well, I mean, it's important to appreciate that a lot goes into the intelligence process, whether we're talking for national security, the military, diplomacy, homeland security and law enforcement, but also for business in the private sector. When we think about the intelligence process, it's exhaustive in terms of there's a tasking phase, then there's a collection phase, depending upon the circumstances of both what we would call classified information or secret sources. This is usually associated with US government operations or open sources or open sources. This collection is, again, multifaceted. People collect the information, what we call human. There are technical means of collecting information. There are also new forms of what I would call open source information that are just as important. For example, social media. There's a whole new area of intelligence known as social media intelligence. And a lot can be gleaned from this source as well, much of it applicable to the business environment. But once the collection is done, which can be a weighty process, there's the hard, or I should say there's the challenge of processing the information, putting it into a usable form. Sometimes the information is in another language. Sometimes the information is in a technical form and has to be put in what we would call a plain text that can be utilized by consumers. And once processing has happened, then the material, the information has to be analyzed. And this is the critical stage. And perhaps the one that is the most challenging. It's both an art and a science. Many who are engaged in intelligence analysis utilize these days structured analytic techniques to help verify the data, cross-check it with other information coming in to make sure it's true and accurate. This is particularly important in today's age of misinformation and disinformation. And then once the information has been fully analyzed, does it truly become intelligence? Then there's the hard task of dissemination. Who should get this information? And again, it depends on the sector that we're talking about. There are going to be different recipients for the intelligence, depending on whether it's for national security purposes, law enforcement purposes, or business applications.
And I think the process that you just detailed are great suggestions. Obviously, in the maritime and supply chain, as a lot of people are seeing both opportunities and challenges, I think a lot of people also misunderstand that intelligence is not necessarily, first of all, competitive intelligence, and I think you've hinted to it, is not espionage. Obviously, the military and other agencies, there are people who do this, but for the businesses, when we talk about competitive intelligence, that is not corporate espionage. And I think that's very important. The basic function of an organization and understanding that it requires, I think what I'm getting from your description here is training the mind to be thinking about the process where you would gather through a very deliberate process some potential indicators, early indicators of risk and opportunities for particular market. They may seem obvious, but in some cases, like you just said, through various social media collection and analysis, you can actually pick up what we call early signals. Is that correct? For corporate decision making or directions or intent or poking. And sometimes for some companies, some of this behaviors of social media actually for some companies may lead to people thinking they're going in a particular direction. Is that correct? So we hear about financial report and statistical market, and those are great. Those are usually hard data. The Bureau of Statistics, for example, or a statement of what's going on. But I think what's important here is that when we're talking about the gathering of information, competitive intelligence really provides organization kind of like a different perspective of either development opportunities or events that could or could not yield potential competitive edge, I think. What do you think?
Absolutely, David. Yeah. Competitive intelligence or business intelligence is, as you mentioned, is not espionage. This is, again, open source research. It's market analysis, really to help a company, a firm, have a potential competitive advantage down the line. In today's age of globalization, where many businesses are operating in complex environments, and timely, accurate, and viable, I should say, also actionable business intelligence is critical to operations that a company or a firm may be engaged in, not just domestically, but globally around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. This is great, Larry. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. Certainly appreciate your time today.
Thank you, David.
All right, folks. Again, thank you for joining us today for the episode of our South Carolina Trade Talk. Again, an offering made available at the Citadel at the Tommy and Victoria Baker School of Business. I'm Dr. David Laplace, and I look forward to seeing you on a future podcast.